Hi, everybody. It's Tom, and I'm jumping on here to let you know that we ended up making this a two-part series. So this is episode 1. You're listening to Beyond the Ballot AZ. I'm Tom Collins, Executive Director of the Arizona Clean Elections Commission.
And I'm Gina Roberts, Voter Education Director.
Today we're talking about redistricting. With everything going on in Texas, it sparked a really interesting conversation because we're pretty much the only democracy that defaults to letting elected officials choose their own boundaries.
Right. So some states like Arizona have changed that. Back in 2000, Arizona voters passed a citizens initiative to make the Independent Redistricting Commission, or the IRC, which is a nonpartisan body responsible for drawing the congressional and legislative district lines.
And with Texas putting a spotlight on a process many people might not be familiar with, we wanted to cover how redistricting works in Arizona, nationally, and what you need to know. We're here with Justin Levitt. He's a professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and has done extensive work related to redistricting. He's also served in federal government and runs a website called All About Redistricting, where you can find out everything you'd want to know about redistricting as this develops. Also, Professor Levitt is a very, very important national voice in election law and policy. So we're really thrilled to have him join our podcast and to bring him to folks here in Arizona to talk about this issue. So, Professor Levitt, thanks for joining us.
Of course. It's a delight to be with you.
So, Arizona is one of a handful of states that has an independent redistricting commission. And so as we're all sort of thinking about redistricting, can you explain what that means for people who live here in Arizona and why that matters?
Yeah, Arizona was sort of relatively early on in deciding that the people should be in charge of how they get represented. Simple as that. In most of the country for a very long time, legislators were really in charge, redistricting, drawing district lines for who gets elected to office where is like a statute, like any other. But in places where there were ballot initiatives, where the people had the ability to change the rules of government, the people increasingly took that option. And Democrats took it, Independents took it, Republicans took it. This is a very bipartisan thing where the people have the opportunity to tell politicians where the line should be rather than politicians picking their voters. The people have exercised that power, and Arizona did that as well. A couple decades ago now, Arizona put in place an independent body to draw the lines that doesn't ask people to forget politics when they walk in the door, but it does mean that they're not drawing lines for the benefit of incumbents. They're not drawing lines to reward their friends and punish their enemies. And that turns out to be tremendously important. And it's something that following that lead, California and Colorado and Michigan have done, where Democratic voters have taken the power away from Democratic officials. And in places like Idaho and Montana and Utah, Republican voters have tried to take away the power from Republican officials. This is a very bipartisan measure for people to want to be more in charge.
So just looking at the country as a whole, how many states are we talking about that actually have independent redistricting commissions as opposed to those where the legislature will draw the lines?
So it's growing, first of all. It's about 10-ish. And the reason there's an ish is that the commissions vary in how they're set up. Some are more independent than others. Some have sitting politicians drawing the lines in a bipartisan way. Some have people who don't really have a connection to politics drawing the lines. Some have a connection to politics but aren't themselves incumbents. So you got a few shades of gray. But I would say 10 to 12-ish are really in charge of the process. And like I said, Arizona was relatively early on in that.
And do we see major differences between those states and how, in the final product of those lines, whether they're congressional or legislative? I guess, what are the positives and negatives between, where one state uses an IRC or another state, the legislature does it. So, why would voters elect to have an IRC? And, does it truly make a difference in the outcome of those final lines that are adopted?
It's a great question. And I think it does make a difference. I think the biggest difference it makes is that in states where the commission is drawing the lines, you tend not to have districts drawn for particular incumbents or for particular parties. There are legendary stories in redistricting of incumbents drawing the lines to box out particular officials or include a donor or a large business or a mistress or somebody else in the legislative arena. In the 2000 cycle, Congressman Bobby Rush got the Illinois state legislature to draw Barack Obama, then State Senator Barack Obama, out of Bobby Rush's district, a block to the north, a block to the west, 2 blocks to the south, and to the east is Lake Michigan. So took a little X-Acto knife and just cut him out of the district. And that actually led directly to different district for then State Senator Barack Obama, then U.S. Senator Barack Obama, then President Barack Obama. Changed sort of the course of Illinois political history. But the point is, when you have independent commissions doing the line drawing, they don't draw lines, they don't draw districts that look like that either exact vengeance or retribution or particular gain for individual incumbents or individual challengers. The rest of how districts may look when an independent commission draws really depends on the rules the independent commission is applying. And the vast majority of them choose commissioners, some closer to politics, some a little further from politics. They take their jobs really seriously, like juries take their jobs really seriously. And they follow the rules that the state gives them. Every state's rules are a little bit different in this respect. So Arizona, for example, is one of the few states that prioritizes competition, that asks for districts, all else equal, to be a little more competitive if they can be. Other states don't ask for that. So in Arizona, you have lines that are a little more competitive when they can be, when that doesn't sacrifice anything else. In other states, you might not have that as a feature, but that's because the commission wasn't told to make that a feature. So the other outcomes in other states really depend on what the state law is.
So you mentioned this is obviously a partisan result, right? But that party might be blunted in terms of how an independent redistricting commission works. We have an ongoing, sort of national debate now about mid-decade redistricting, where the express argument is to advance partisan interest and to advance them in a way that is sort of correlated to the nationalization of politics, right? So it's going to be R's from the top down, D's from the top down, which is a very different sort of set of principles to operate from. That's a real tension that maybe wasn't there when voters were deciding on independent redistricting commissions in the first instance.
Well, I think that it's always been something that's been present. And the voters generally decide that they have things they care about in representation. They care about party for sure, but they also care about other stuff. They care about the fact that they have a member of Congress who's going to respond to them because they're from the community or they're from the neighborhood. They care about the fact that they have state legislators who respond to their local concerns. That is, there's more that voters care about than just a D or an R by their representative's name. And that's abundantly true in this process, that who your representative is really matters. And representatives that know the community or communities really matter. You're right that redistricting inevitably has partisan effects. No matter where you draw the lines, that's going to mean somebody wins and somebody loses from a partisan outcome, because people live in places and people have partisan preferences. But that doesn't mean that the districts have to be drawn for partisan reasons. You can draw a set of districts to respond to real communities and sort of let the chips fall where they may. And most of the independent commissions have rules that say, we're not asking you to get to a particular outcome. We just don't want you to intentionally set out to favor or not favor particular parties or incumbents in this process. Arizona's got something very much like that. So does California, where I sit. And you find that, sure, some of the maps lean slightly one way or another when they're drawn that way. That's natural. That's very different from turning the partisan engine all the way up to 11. Cranking it as hard as it can in order to make sure that your friends win and your enemies lose, no matter what the districts look like, no matter what the communities, how they get represented, no matter where the representatives are from. I think what you're seeing right now is turning way past 11. And I think it's notable that it's happening in places, or at least it's starting in places, that don't have independent commissions like Arizona. And In places like California, the discussion isn't whether the independent body should go back and draw lines. The discussion is whether the voters want to take the power away from that independent commission. Because the independent commission works for voters and works for communities in a way that isn't exactly what the national political parties want. And I think you see in all of these measures where voters have taken the power back for themselves, I think you see voters prefer that. Voters prefer that by a lot. They would much rather draw districts for real representation and let the chips fall where they may, even than get their own partisan outcomes maximized as much as they can. Right? California voters could have had the Democratic legislature draw the lines, but they took that power away. And that was Democrats saying, we don't want this. Utah did the same thing. Republican voters saying, we don't want this. We want people to represent us, even if that means that we're not able to extract as much partisanship as we possibly can. And I got to add, because it's nowhere in this conversation, the Supreme Court has said that maximizing partisanship is unconstitutional. Voters are doing the right thing here.
Thanks for sticking with us. We have a full redistricting explainer page on our website at azcleanelections.gov. Plus, Professor Levitt runs a website all about redistricting that covers redistricting across states.
Another great spot for information is the Arizona IRC's website. They'll have legislative and congressional district maps that are currently active, plus more information about how you, the voter, can get involved.
And if after this conversation you want to learn more about your own district, we have our Find My Elected Officials tool linked in the show notes.
That's it for today's Beyond the Ballot AZ, but we're continuing this important conversation with Professor Levitt in our next episode. I'm Gina Roberts.
And I'm Tom Collins. We'll see you next time.